Hello and welcome back. This video is going to go over the first step in the request lifecycle of a builder. And this kind of goes the same for a form builder or a table builder or what have you, but we're working with form builders in this case. So this is the first step in the lifecycle of a form builder, and that is the build process. The build process is what is responsible for taking all of your array definitions and your closures and what have you, the stuff that you've configured in and around your form builder, and creating and instantiating classes and objects and collections of classes and things on the actual form object. So to reference the example module that I made in the last video, let's take a look at the controller that was created for us for the control panel, and let's look at the create method. And you'll see here all it does is returns a render method, and we get this magical form on the front end. And if I go and log in, I've created a couple fields, just a name and a slug. The slug is required. Let's go to the example module that I made and create a new widget. Okay, so we've got the name and the slug. This stuff is already here for us. We've got a button. Buttons over here. We've got a couple actions. We're creating a widget, and all we had to do was a couple migrations for the fields, which include a stream. And if we look at the actual form that was created for us, we don't have anything in it. I deleted everything, which was empty anyways in the last video, but there's nothing defined. So how is it that when this form is built that we get all of this stuff pre-configured for us? So that's kind of some of the stuff I'm going to show you in this video, and it's going to be pretty cool. So let's check it out. So let's go back to our controller and let's take a look at this render method. And if we look, the render is returning a response, and so this is the result of the response that we're seeing. It's a view response. Let's take a look at the render method, and we see here the first thing that's called is make, and then again the first thing is called that the first thing that's called here is build. And build is the first method, whether you're making or posting or rendering or whatever, that's called on a form builder or a table builder or what have you. And this was responsible for taking the actual arrays and converting them into objects and collections. So let's take a look at this method and then this command. The first thing that you'll see that is done is it fires a couple callbacks on the builder. So just to give you an idea of how you can hook into these from the builder itself, let's open that up and create a new method, and it's going to be on, and ready is the name of the trigger. We're going to camel case that, and let's just spit that out real quick. So you'll see the first thing that's done is it hits that. If you wanted to register a callback from the outside, something that you could do, for example, from your controller, we could take that form. It uses the fires callbacks trait, and the stuff is documented, but just to give you an idea of what this would look like, we want to on the ready trigger, provide a callback here. And reload that we see, and we see that that's fired. This is a good idea, or a good example of how you would maybe extend some function, or like inject logic or functionality into a form builder from outside of the add-on. So if you're working on something and you need to extend a form builder from one of my add-ons, or from core, or from somebody else's add-ons, or maybe even one of your own, and just need to conditionally extend it somehow, you can look for these add-ons and register, or look for these callbacks and register callbacks from the outside. That way you don't actually have to manipulate the class itself. So that's a good thing to know how to do. If we jump back into render and go back up through to the build method, you'll see that the first thing it does, and really the only thing that it does, is the build form. And this is the substantial part of this method. I'm going to walk through these one by one and just kind of show you how things work, where it looks for things, and then we'll get into a little bit further down here where it's actually building fields and sections and the actual components of the form. So starting at the top, the first thing it does is it looks for the form model. And by default, it's going to use class transformation to transform widget form builder. In the form namespace, it's going to go back in namespace, drop the form builder part, and add model. So it's going to look for widget model by default. If there's nothing defined, it's going to check if that exists and use it. So that's like a fallback. The other thing that you could do if you want to bring your own model, you can do something like this. And it'll use your example model instead. And in that case, it won't even look for class transformation. And then the other thing that you can do is use the set model from the outside. All of the properties on the builder have setters and getters, so feel free to manipulate from the outside as needed. Next, it's going to set the form stream, and it does this because the stream contains incremental information that we set up, further back. So it's going to have fields, and it's going to have table names and stream field assignments, and it's going to have a lot of handy information that we can use to guess things going forward and to help automate things going forward. And really setting the form stream is crucial for automation because it holds a lot of information that we can incrementally build on. By default, it looks at the model that we're using, and if it's an entry model, it can extract the stream out of that and sets it accordingly. The next thing it does is sets the repository. So the repository is responsible for taking the entry out of the database if one exists, and then putting one back in when you save or update. By default, it uses an entry or eloquent form repository based on the kind of model that you attached. And you can bring your own, for example, by, again, defining that property on the builder. I'm going to close out some of these just to not get confused. So you can define the repository as a class here. You can also use class transformation, and what this is called is property handling. So repositories, options, buttons, actions, fields can use property handlers. And what I mean by that is if we create a new class here, let's call it widget form repository. And in this particular case, we do need to implement the form repository interface. And you'll see that there's a couple methods in here. Find or new finds the entry or returns a new instance. And then save. And it takes the form builder and then it leaves the rest up to you and to implement the actual saving to the database. If we wanted to create a property handler for buttons, and this is more of a common handler that you'll see, widget form buttons, and all of the property handlers are going to look for a handle method, and they're going to accept the builder instance itself, and then you'll be able to set your buttons this way. And this is great if you need to include, for example, a closure, or if you need more logic tied into the buttons rather than just setting it as a property. This is a great way to set it as like a dynamic set of buttons, or a more complex closure-based set of buttons. So that's kind of how you would extend that thing. And you can do the same thing for actions or any property, really. Repository is a little bit different because this is actually the repository that's going to be used, but actions, builders, options, fields, stuff like that, sections, they can all be created the same exact way with property handlers like this. So it could be widget form sections and it would set sections. It could be widget form fields and set fields. It could be any different property. In the case of tables, it could be widget table row, or widget table columns, widget table actions, widget table buttons, and what have you. So that's a common pattern that you'll see, and it's good to know how that works, and we'll get into why that works in a little bit. So for now, let's delete those and hop back into the command. So after that, we set the form entry, and this is going to use the repository that we have already set, and it's going to use the form model as well. It's going to put the model into a repository. It's going to use a repository to either get or create a new entry for the form and set that. So at this point, going forward, we have an entry object that will inevitably be updated or saved or whatever, that we can manipulate. So we can do things to it and it'll make its way into the database if we adjust a property. So what an example of how that might be used is when just before saving, there's another callback that's fired, and on saving is how you would hook into that because the trigger is saving, and we can do something like this. Get the form entry, and this is the actual entry object. So since we're prior to saving, we can do something like entry value equals test, and that'll, if that's an attribute or a field value or whatever, that can make its way into the database, or it can be used later on in the process, whatever you want to do there. But just an example of how you might hook into maybe automating a field value or something based on something else. So the next thing that it does is set default parameters, and this one is let's take a look here. This is going to use reflection on the builder, and this is why you can use property handlers. It's going to look through all properties, and if there's no getter for it, meaning if you can't get it out, if there's no getter and setter for it, then it'll skip it. If the parameter already has a value, so if it's going to do, for example, buttons. If this builder get buttons has a value, then we don't need a handler for it. So we're going to, again, continue. And then we're going to check for a handler. So we're going to take form builder, and we're going to create the handler name from it. So for buttons, it's going to be widget form buttons, widget form actions, widget form whatever. And then if the class exists, that's where it's going to either, if you define a handler yourself, so it'll pick up handlers next to the builder class like I showed you before. It'll pick up widget form buttons automatically. But let's say you have a generic handler, maybe something like widget form stuff. And in here you want to do public function buttons. We'll call it do buttons, or we'll call it whatever you want. You can again inject your builder just like you normally would and do your set buttons like that. And then on your form builder, let's say you wanted to use that same widget form stuff for handling all of your properties. You might do something like this. Let's see here. Buttons equals widget form stuff and the class, and then we just define the actual property or the method that we want to run. And so that's why if you leave that off, it'll default to handle. But this is just an example of if you want to use the same class to handle all these things, you can define the method to use here. So good to know. And I'm going to delete this again, clean up after myself here. And so that's why all of the property handlers work. And as you can see, it'll do that for nearly every property that we have. A couple that it will not do is model and repository. So anything that actually has a getter or setter on the form builder other than model or repository will look automatically for property handlers to delegate setting that value to another class or other logic. And that's a pretty important one, because when you're dealing with buttons that are complex, maybe they change based on the entry or whatever, that's a good thing to know how to do, because you're going to need somewhere to put that logic. So moving on down, the next thing is set form options, and this is where some of the option handler is handled just slightly different because of the nature of the option collection, but it's pretty much it's evaluating options for an option property handler. Set default options is just going to set up some generic defaults like the form view, the wrapper view, permissions. Permissions by default are going to use the module namespace slug, the stream slug.write, because forms write to the database. It'll default the permission there for you. Otherwise, you can define it in the options as well. From there, we're going to load form errors, and this is going to be errors that might be coming back from a previous post, or like we posted and we're redirecting back to the form, they got flashed. We're going to load the errors in this way. That way we can look at which fields have errors and designate those. So it's not just about displaying the form errors, it's also about which field has an error in the first place so that you can pick those out if you need to. Next we're going to authorize the form, and that's where that permission comes into play. And this will use the authorizer service in the Streams platform to take that permission string and the active user and see if they have that permission. Next, it'll build fields, and so now we're getting into the builder process. And for all of these build fields, build sections, build actions, there's a common pattern that's done. We're of course going to have our value already set based on a property handler or the property on the builder, or however you set the fields. It's going to take those and then it's going to put it through the build process, and it looks the same for nearly everything. It's going to differ slightly, but all in all it's going to look very, very similar. And let's get into that and see what that does. So we're just going to build. It's going to use the field builder and pass it the builder. I know that sounds a little bit confusing, and we can skip some of this stuff. This is what I want to show you here though. Input reading. And input reading is, it's going to read what input, if any, you have provided for this particular component. In this case it's a field, and again this is very, very, very similar for buttons, actions, whatever, for any builder that you're building. It's going to be very similar, but first it reads the input and it's going to normalize and do stuff like that. So let's take a look at what exactly this does. The first thing is going to be resolving the property. So if we've got like maybe the field type is delegated to again a handler like we used for like I showed you earlier. So maybe the type is delegated to a handler. It'll resolve all of these and return the values from those handlers. And that's a pretty complex thing, and I've used it some, but when you need it, it's awesome that it's there. It lets you do some pretty complex stuff. The normalizer is going to take the array input that you've provided, and let's say you only provide the field slug. It's going to expand that into the field slug and a little bit of other information like the field type and stuff. The evaluator is going to look for closures and evaluate those. Next is defaults. So if we have no fields whatsoever defined, or if there's no input defined at all, it's going to set the defaults. Filler is specific to fields. This is if you define fields in your field builder or in your form builder. Let's say you do something like this. You want to include all fields, and let's say we do something like this and override the label. And if we look at our form again here, we see that we've overridden the label. The filler is going to take this and expand it into the other fields that are that should be there. Next, we're going to normalize again, and then we're going to guess, and this is going to be like let's see what it guesses. It guesses labels, it guesses uniqueness, enabled flags, warning flags. It guesses all of this stuff primarily based on the stream information that we've provided. So we can provide nothing, and a lot of this stuff is brought in automatically because of using the streams workflow. Next, we're going to parse it, and this is going to be something like if we have a label that includes maybe you want to have the label include the user's username or name, then you can include that, and this will parse tags in the values. And then we've got a translator and a populator that populates all of the field values. So this resolver, normalizer, evaluator, defaults, guessing, and parsing, all that kind of stuff happens for nearly every component that the builder is building. It happens for actions, it happens for buttons, it happens for sections and everything. So it's good to know that this stuff happens behind the scenes so that you know that you can leverage this stuff for even like table columns and table buttons and filters, and all of that stuff goes through input reading. So that's very important to know. And as we back up, the next thing it does is build sections. And then we build actions. And again, if we look in here, look at the build actions, it's got a builder that builds. And it's got an input reader. And then we resolve. We've got defaults. We've got a predictor in this case, which predicts values based on other values found in the form builder. We've got a normalizer. We've got a drop down. It looks like it flattens the drop down, and then down here it builds the drop down back up. We've got a guesser again, and in this case, what are we guessing? We're guessing if it's enabled or not, and we're guessing the redirect. Let's take a look just as an example. See, we've got if the action is a save, submit, or save and exit, it'll guess the redirect. We've got save and create, update, save and edit. We've got all these things that it'll, and look, it's setting a closure here, which will be ran through the evaluator later, but we're guessing the redirect in here. And it's good to know kind of where to find these and know that it's happening in the background, just so, this stuff isn't magic, but a lot of the quote-unquote magic that you do experience is from input reading because of the guessing and the automation. So let's back out again. Next we have set active action, and you'll see this with tables too. Basically, when you submit the form, what button did you click? Did you click update? Did you click save and exit? Set active action is going to detect that so that we can determine where to redirect and what to do. Maybe you have save and create another, or save and duplicate. I don't know. It's kind of up to you on what kind of actions you use or build. But this is going to set the default one based on what you clicked or how the form was submitted. And then lastly we build buttons, and then we fire an event. So that's and just to give you real quick to show you, let's build fields, and we'll go into the build process, and I want to go into the input, and I want to look at what we have here. Oops, builder, get fields. So let's output the fields before we go through any of the input reading, and we'll see that we have, let's delete that real quick so we can see the full effect. So we have nothing defined. We don't have any fields defined, but we do have a stream attached to this based on the model and the stream model, or the stream that's attached to that model and whatnot, migrations that we set up beforehand. So let's move this down a little bit, and let's see what we end up with. So we've got still an array at this point, and we have the field, we have the label, we have a prefix, and the prefix is in case you're running multiple forms on the same page. The prefix helps separate input and execution of those forms. We've got required, we've got a rules array, we have a translatable flag, and we've got the value, and then same for the other one. So this is how we come from nothing into a lot of cool stuff based on this input reader. And if we back out of here and go down to the bottom and do get form fields, because when the builder builds the components, it takes the definitions and moves them into the actual form object as classes and objects. If we reload this, and now we have a field collection. We have a text field type and a slug field type, and we've got this full object that we can work with, and that's why especially like if you override a view and you have all these cool things that you can override, but this is the gist of what builders do. They take the array and they take the input or lack of input, and they build it up, and they guess, and they automate things, and they use pre-registered things and merge those in, and then from there they create an object just like a factory basically would. And in fact, there is a factory that makes these objects from the array, but that's the gist of what the build method does. And this is just an example output of that. One thing that you will let's take a look real quick at buttons, and we'll take a look at the input reader for these. And you'll see here that we have a lookup. Lookups are what is going to take, for example, if you define a save button or action, it's going to take that save, and first it's normalized in, let's see, we'll do get buttons. So it's going to take that default. So if we look at the default here, we have nothing so far. It defaults to just cancel. That's why all the forms by default you see the cancel button. We just have a simple string here. The normalizer basically pushes it into the minimum requirement. So we've got an attributes array and a button definition. And cancel doesn't really tell us a whole lot about the button until you get to the lookup portion. And that cancel is going to be referenced in the button registry, and it's going to be extended into its text, its type. It's a default type button, and that remains. So if we take a look at merge, and we're going to do here, and we look up here for, and this is the button registry, and there's a lot of different registries for buttons, for actions, for icons, for all kinds of stuff. So it looks up this cancel here, and it automates the text and the type. So if we were to have options instead of cancel, button equals options, it would expand these. And with that, we can override too. So let's say we wanted to define our own cancel. Let's see, let's do protected buttons. And let's do options. I'm going to close that and reload our form here. So now we've got this options here, and again it gets it from our button registry. We have options. It's doing the text, the color, and the icon for us. And maybe we want to override this text. All we have to do is define a little bit more. And it'll merge those in, and you can just keep kind of building on top of defaults if you want. So that's a good thing to know how to do, and that works exactly the same for fields, for actions, for buttons, for whatever you're building. Define a little bit more and it'll override it. So if we keep going down the list, let's just see what that ends up being entirely. And not a whole lot more except for the href attribute. Cancels, so it takes off the create part and just puts us back at the table. So that's a good example of how a simple cancel string can be expanded and built into this. And then if we go back even further and look at what it actually created, build buttons. Oh, that's right. I need to get the form buttons because they are pushed. Because they're pushed into the form as objects, not onto the builder. So if I reload, I've got a button collection now, and I've got a button class, and I've got the properties here. And this is a good way to see what you can define too. You can define permission for buttons. You can define whether it's disabled, enabled. You can define multiple attributes. You can define a drop down of more buttons. You can define the drop down position here. And these are all in documentation, but it's good to know kind of where the array ends up. It hydrates this class with your array information. So that's just that's kind of how that process all works. Close out of that. We're done there. And at the end, it fires an event, like I said, and we have the form at least completely built, so we can look through and let's see. Let's take a look at the actual form before we get done. Build form. So at the end of everything, this is what we're left with. We have our model, which has been set. We have our stream, which has been set. We have an entry, which has been set. And if you look, there's no ID on here just yet because it's a new one we're creating. The content and the response are going to be built later on, and we'll take a look at those later. We've got a mode. We're in create mode because it's a new entry. We have an array of data, and this is something that you can push information into to access in the view if you need to. We have any errors. We have values, which will be empty because we're not posting. We have a field collection of fields to display. Our options collection is populated with some stuff. We've got form wrapper, or a form view, wrapper view, and permission automatically all here. Our actions, buttons, sections, it's all here. And from here, we go into posting the form and handling data and getting into some other stuff. But the build process is by far and large probably one of the most important steps to really understand, because a lot of what we'll get into later relies on knowing how to configure your form builder the way that you want and what the different components do. So it's good to revert back to this particular step and take a look at how things are built and what is available even. If you look at, this is a text field type. There's just all kinds of stuff that's available to customize what you need to do. So from here you can take a look. Okay, so let's have a look-see at the text field type, and you can see what's going on here, and then you can get into the base field type. So it's good to know whether you're debugging or kind of exploring how these things are used, and it's pretty cool stuff. So like I said, the next video we'll get into posting and handling the rest of the request lifecycle for forms. And until then, take her easy.